Okay, in this video, I'm going to go in and talk in more detail about objective assessments. In other words, the assessments that we use to measure remembering and understanding and to some extent reasoning. And then also address cheating and talk about that because I get a lot of questions about how to handle or address cheating online. Misconceptions around cheating and maybe even misconceptions about that it's easier to cheat online, and that raises questions around proctoring. And all of this tends to come up around objective assessments because those really tend to be technically the easiest of assessments to cheat on. So let's get going. So we talked about in the other videos about different types of knowledge or learning that we can assess, and that includes knowledge and reasoning. And here we're really focused in this area under remembering and understanding. And again, questions that come up around proctoring and using these types of assessments. Let's talk first of all about what exactly it is that we're measuring. Because sometimes I think I hear folks maybe wax dismissive of this. Some folks either only measure this or they view this as lower order learning, and so they skip over this as well. But it definitely has some value, and I think it helps to more deeply understand just exactly what it is that we're measuring here when we measure remembering and understanding. So these are the three types of measures that we usually talk about when measuring this type of learning. We talk about measuring recognition, retention, and cognitive transfer. And really, these build on each other. So we can certainly think of them. I know this depicts it hierarchically, and some people don't like hierarchical depictions, but these are definitely building blocks. Reaching transfer, which is sort of a holy grail of instruction, requires that students pay attention and understand what they're paying attention to. Recognition is exactly that. It's measuring can the students recognize instruction that they should have seen or should have heard. And retention is helping us answer the question of can they articulate or reiterate a concept. And then transfers, can they take their understanding of that concept and apply that concept to new information or a new setting. So again, not just being able to work out, for example, a mathematical problem that they've already seen, but if they're given a different problem of the same type, can they work out that problem? And that's really what we want to achieve, is that sort of transfer that, okay, now that you've learned this basic idea, can you do different things with it? If not, let's work the building blocks again this way. If they can't recognize instruction, then they weren't paying attention. And typically motivation of some sort is probably a barrier, although it could also be distraction in their learning environments, especially at home. And we can talk about strategies for how we help even younger learners manage distractions. But you want to get a sense of, let's say you're measuring or assessing them up here and they're not answering it. Well, if it helps to know, well, are they even recognizing it? Have they even paid attention? And then retention are, if they were paying attention, but they can't articulate something or explain it back to you or, pick an example or something like that, then there's probably an instructional issue because we know they're paying attention based on recognition questions, but it's not sticking. So at that point, we may want to look at strategies like what are the examples that I'm giving them? Are the materials confusing and leading to misconceptions or leading to confusion? Am I just presenting information to them but not having them actually do something with that so that they begin to understand these principles? And then looking at cognitive transfer, let's say we know that they're paying attention and they've understood it, but they can't apply it to new information, then that's really what we call inert knowledge. You've heard me use that term a couple of times throughout, but that's knowledge that may be stuck in the head, but a learner can't actually do something with that knowledge. And if you're seeing this show up, then what that may suggest is that you want to use more examples that represent a range of ideas or a range of examples and help them draw linkages and actually actively facilitate that transfer and help them make those connections. So when you're designing, say, tests and quizzes, it's a good idea to build in different types of test items that measure recognition, retention, and transfer. And that way you can not just assess their learning, but even be able to go in and diagnose what's going on with the learners. Most of the assessments that I see that are objective assessments actually tend to assess recognition and retention, fairly good at that. I don't tend to see as many that are actually measuring cognitive transfer. You may want to give some thought as to how you can build in some questions where they take what they have learned and now apply it to something that's new, but that they should be able to apply it to. So again, a few examples of how we can assess students on knowledge or reasoning. Quizzes or test tools, we can have them work on worked problems, or we could use audio voice threads online, for example, in language instruction. And then I also covered some of these examples in the previous video as well. You could use quizzes or tests or tools, but with open-ended items. Okay, so let's talk about cheating and what you can do. This is based on some of the research on cheating. I have to admit, I got a lot of questions about this, and cheating is not my particular area of expertise, although it does, like I said, it comes up a lot. We get a lot of questions about it. So as I went through reading the research and trying to find helpful information and advice on folks, I have to admit, I did not expect the research on cheating to be inspiring, but it is, and we'll find out why. So a lot of what I'm going to cover here is pulled from this book, Cheating Lessons by James Lang. Now, this is certainly situated in the higher ed context, but frankly, cheating is a very understudied phenomenon. This really represents the most of the research on cheating. But it certainly translates, even if it's situated in a higher ed context. So what he really tells a story of in this book on cheating is that you best address cheating through designing effective learning. And by designing effective learning, you help address cheating. So there's a very positive impact loop between these two things. And that's why I say I find it inspiring, because to really address cheating, you actually have to focus on designing effective learning and instruction. And that's all very fun and creative and inspiring. So take a moment. What would you say the levels of cheating are? You think they're increasing, decreasing, or remaining roughly the same? We can't really say for certain whether there is more or less or about the same, in part because this is so poorly studied. Research indicates that cheating rates rose in the 1990s, but then actually have been dropping substantially over the past decade. A lot of these studies are largely self-report. In other words, it's students saying, yeah, I cheated, or no, I didn't cheat. And we know that self-report is not very reliable. Students' views of what constitutes cheating are shifting. So I may see a student behavior and think that that's cheating, and they may not. We'll talk a little bit about that. But for example, we see the same thing with online where around intellectual property and copyright, I may think, oh, I've created something and posted it and it's mine, and somebody may take that and, reuse it or mash it up with something or whatever. So same thing around cheating. What students view as cheating are changing, and they're also very culturally bound. So how rampant would you say cheating is? Very, somewhat, or not much at all. So here's a statistic that a lot of people have heard and shared around cheating, that 75 to 87% of students have cheated. But what this actually is that these are students who have reported that they have cheated once during their entire academic career. So all throughout school and college, they've cheated just once. That's what this number represents. So let's say this represents like classes they've taken or years or whatever. What this means is that out of all of these times, students have only cheated once. So you can't think about, oh my goodness, 75% of the students in my class are going to try and cheat. What the statistic actually means is that somewhere over their lives, 75 to 80% of students say that they've cheated once. 19 to 38%, depending on the survey, report that they've cheated 3 times or more during their career. So what this suggests to us is that the prevalence of cheating is probably lower than what you think it is or what you may have heard, in part because this statistic has been so badly reported, like in media and on blogs and things like that, and it's really misunderstood and taken out of context. So chances are cheating's not as rampant as you think. And again, this also means, this could mean some students only cheat 3 times throughout their entire academic career. Could mean some cheat 5. Could mean some cheat all the time. That there's extremely wide variability here. But we know that the number of students who cheat all the time is extremely low. So Lang says these alarmist arguments about the state of cheating in higher education today lead to alarmist responses, like proctoring, some of which require lots of activity to achieve little effect. And I would add to that, some of which require a lot of money to achieve little effect as well. So in order to address this problem successfully, we have to understand it first. And I really think Lang provides us such a great way to think about cheating and what can we do to address it. So a lot of the research started by looking at dispositional factors among learners or individual characteristics, like, does this vary by race or religion or gender or membership in a fraternity or sorority? Again, remember, this is mainly higher ed. And of course, none of these matter. Not surprising, but these don't predict anything. However, we have found that like membership in a fraternity or sorority is very interesting. One social group or cultural influences, we could recode this as cultural influences as well, or contextual factors do influence cheating. So there are some variables that other researchers have looked at, like the campus environment, students' living situations, composition of their peer groups, which again, kind of touches on this, and the classroom environment. So researchers have found that these contextual factors maybe have a little bit of influence, but let's be honest, we have very little control over the campus environment or students' living situations or the composition of their peer group or things like that. You may have more control over the school environment. We'll talk a little bit about culture as an aspect in a little bit. But where we have direct control is over the classroom environment. And it turns out there's a lot that we can do in the classroom environment. So I have to say, one of the things I love about this research is it reflects research on human performance more broadly, which is an area of my expertise, that suggests that while we put a lot of focus on the individual, most of the drivers for behavior and performance really come from the system. So, example, policies, resources, rewards, consequences, or lack thereof, lack of resources or rewards or consequences. Those tend to drive behavior way more than individual characteristics. So there's a saying by Gary Rumler, one of my favorite organizational developers, that if you pit a good performer against a bad system, the system will win almost every time. People are smart and they know when they are pitted or feel pitted against a bad system. And this is when they start to try to game that system to beat it and start to justify their behaviors. So that's when we start to see cheating behavior show up in students. So let's focus in on this classroom environment, because it turns out there's a lot about the classroom environment that influences cheating. Doesn't mean it's everything, but there are aspects of it. And this means that we as instructors have the ability to address the problem as well. Okay, so classroom environment. Lang makes a really interesting observation in his book about the studies on cheating, and about one study in particular called the Princess Alice study. He notes that the researchers knew very well how to construct a situation that induces children to cheat. And this is a fascinating research study. If you look up Princess Alice and how they designed this study, if we step back and think about it for a second, like he says, the researchers knew how to construct a situation that induced children to cheat. Both sets of researchers seemed aware that if you want people to cheat or not cheat on a task, you don't focus on their gender or their membership in a fraternity or any other features of their personality or life situation that might dispose them to cheat. Instead, you modify the environment in which they are completing the task. As Ariely, the researcher, puts it, in reference to the kinds of dishonesty that take place in our everyday lives, the amount of cheating in which human beings are willing to engage, quote, depends on the structure of our daily environment, end quote. So Lang argues that logically this suggests us that the amount of cheating that takes place in educational settings may very well depend on the structures of the learning environments, and studies where these conditions are changed support this hypothesis. So what we see in terms of conditions that lead to cheating, there's a strong emphasis on performance, and like I mentioned earlier, for example, a single outcome or a small number of outcomes. Extremely high stakes, a lot is riding on one or a few performances. And learners are extrinsically motivated. In other words, their extrinsic reward or threat of punishment rather than the joy of learning or completing the task itself, or learning something so that you can go apply that and actually use it in your day-to-day life or on the job. So for example, examples of extrinsic motivation are grades, payment on, getting paid for your job, entry into a profession, so maybe you have to pass an exam if you're going to get into the profession that you want. And so this is a focus on what happens after the performance, not on the actual performance itself. So anytime somebody's worried about, well, if I don't perform well on this test, then X or Y will happen, that's extrinsic motivation. And the more, especially if the stakes are high for that extrinsic motivation, then those are conditions for cheating. Another one that you may not think about, but is also low self-efficacy. So learners who lack confidence in their ability to complete a task successfully are also more likely to cheat. And so if you add somebody who's got low self-efficacy, they don't have very much confidence in their ability, now you put them in an environment where there's a very strong emphasis on a performance, on a test. And there's a lot is riding on just one or two. And if they don't pass that test, they're not going to be able to progress, or they'll be failed out of a program, or they won't be able to go into the profession they want, or something like that. Now you've got an environment that's very conducive to cheating. There may be some times when that makes sense. For example, students have to pass the bar exam to become a lawyer. Most of our classes, though, don't fall under that category. We're not trying to deselect students out of career pathways or whatever. We're wanting them to truly learn the content. We want all of them to learn. So we need to change these conditions in our learning environments. Okay, so these are the conditions that increase cheating. By extension, conditions that reduce cheating are putting an emphasis more on mastery, or shifting the focus to actually learning, being able to understand something, being able to improve on that and develop mastery over time and turn around and apply that. Lowering the stakes from very high stakes to lower, more frequent stakes. Shifting from extrinsic motivation to intrinsic motivation. How can we intrinsically motivate our learners to learn for the sake of learning, or for the sake of being able to do things in one's life, as opposed to, rewards or punishments as a result of an exam performance. And then helping learners increase their self-efficacy, or develop their confidence. And as we address all of these are instructional strategies. So by doing these things over here on this slide, we can decrease cheating and, oh, by the way, increase learning. So it's not simply a matter of just decreasing cheating. The strategies that we employ here also lead to stronger learning outcomes. And I just think that's really darn cool. Okay, so let's take a look real quick at 3 approaches to reducing cheating. There are basically 3 different levels. Most people talk about countermeasures. But anybody who works in a field where they use countermeasures like national security or things like that will tell you typically countermeasures only have limited effect. We really get a lot more, see a lot more effect from the other strategies of course redesign and cultural interventions. So common countermeasures include like time testing, using proctoring, random selection from a test bank, or random presentation of an items. That can help to some extent. But if you're really having issues or concerned about this, it may be time to start considering how your course is designed. In particular, maybe you want to use more frequent assessments instead of having just a few. Or maybe you want to start incorporating more formative assessment like we talked about earlier, or using completely different types of assessment activities and assess different types of learning. And also maybe you want to integrate in feedback and opportunities for learners to apply that feedback for improvement. This in particular is really great for addressing motivation and helping students develop confidence. So remember we talked about formative assessment and opportunities to take that feedback and apply it for improvement and things like that. Well, here we see how this pays dividends in different ways, not just in terms of learning outcomes, but can also help to reduce cheating in your class design. In terms of cultural interventions, changing student attitudes or things like that go a long way as well, much further than these countermeasures. Some things that we've seen in universities and in schools are a marketing campaign about student attitudes. So for example, one university put flyers around the university in like bathrooms and things like that just provided statistics that say something like 10% of our students have admitted to cheating. And what that does is it creates a cultural norm at that university that, oh, well, I don't want to be part of that 10%. And that's only a small percentage of students. Most of us here, as part of our school culture, don't participate in that. So you might want to give a little bit of thought to surveying students about things. And then if you see great results, like celebrate that as an aspect of your culture. Or maybe you want to share more general stats if they're better than your local stats and say, students in school, only 12% actually report cheating or something like that. You may also develop honor codes. I was at the University of Virginia before, and UVA has a very well-known honor code system that's actually student-led. It's not instructor-led, but the students are the ones who usually report honor violations and make a determination if a student needs to be removed from the university for an honor violation or whatnot. So there's different ways to go about honor codes, but having an honor code and having it in place and actually having consequences for things is an important aspect of a cultural intervention. So what can you do, you an instructor? Let's talk about the course redesign. You could change your strategy to multiple small assessments, which lowers the stakes while maintaining accountability. It shifts the emphasis from performance to mastery, so you're not just looking at a single point in time, but what does a student actually accomplish over time? Maybe even look at, okay, I'm going to test you here and test you here, but what I really want to look at is the change over time, not just your outcome on a given test. You could use cumulative module tests, and then you don't need a final. Or, like I keep saying, you could use different types of assessment or even a mixed approach. And I really like using different types of assessment because then we do a better job of aligning our assessment methods with the nature of the learning that we really want to see from our students. This is better for learning because, testing is actually a learning strategy. In fact, it outperforms studying. So if you just have students study, they learn less than if you test them. You can use spaced repetition and retrieval. So instead of just measuring it once, if it's spaced out because you're using multiple small assessments, we know that that actually reinforces our retention of that content over time. It's just kind of how the human brain works. The knowledge is much less likely to be inert because students are far less likely to do what's called binge and dump. So if they're just going to take one test, maybe they binge on that and remember it for long enough to get through a test, but then, a week later, they don't remember hardly anything. So, like I said, this should sound familiar, where, like I talked about in the other video, going from high stakes to really lowering the stakes and integrating in more formative assessment by using these different strategies. Like I said, learning is a delta, not a result. And so how do we facilitate that delta or that change over time? So again, we also know that culture matters. Students who cheat are rarely dishonest in other contexts. So cheating tends to be strongly driven by a particular class environment, the nature of the instruction, as well as the nature of the assessment. We also know from the research that students usually will cheat just enough so that they don't feel bad about themselves. And we also know that there's a little bit of a priming and timing issue around cheating as well. So in this study called the 10 Commandments experiment, students were put into two groups. And in one group, students were asked to list 10 books. In another group, they were asked to list as many of the 10 commandments as they could remember. And then they were given a test on that knowledge. And what they found is that there were no instances of cheating in the group that was asked to list the 10 commandments before they took the test. But timing turns out to be important too. So they ran the same study, but in this other study, they compared students who went through an orientation on integrity and then took an exam 2 weeks later. And then they compared the results to those who did not go through that orientation, and there was no difference whatsoever. But if students took an orientation on integrity or were asked to do something like list the 10 commandments immediately prior to going through an exam, then instances of cheating were statistically significantly lower. So priming students just before they complete an exam or submit an assignment can have an effect. At UVA, for example, we actually always had students write and or sign a statement of the UVA honor code before every test and on every assignment that they submitted. And that's a good example of both priming and timing. We're priming them on the culture and on integrity and values of integrity, and we're also timing it at the point when they are getting ready to either submit or complete their assessment. So some ideas for creating the culture that you desire. In terms of countermeasures, usually this amounts to trying to mitigate cheating at the test level. So it's at the point of the test itself. And we need to learn some lessons from cybersecurity and other fields that countermeasures, they seem intuitive and it's an easy thing to think of, but really they are a small part of the options and they tend to be the least effective. So I think it helps to think about it this way. Countermeasures, may be useful in some very limited instances, but by and large, you really should be using strategies more around course redesign and culture. And again, these are some of the countermeasures that I see used pretty frequently. They may have a time or a place, but more often than not, what's going on is the method of assessment itself is a really poor match for what we want students to learn. And oh, by the way, we've seen real issues evolve around like proctoring and browser lockdowns in particular on your learning culture and your school culture. So you really want to think very carefully about the impacts of these sorts of things, not just on student behavior and learning, but how is it really shaping the culture, and is that really the culture of learning that you want? So some good questions to ask around like proctoring or browser lockdowns is the goal to measure learning or to measure performance? If it's learning, I just really recommend against using proctoring and design courses and assessments differently. If it's performance, is there a way that you can lower the stakes, or can you help students build strong confidence prior to taking the exam as a strategy instead of proctoring? And then, like I said, just be sure to ask yourself, will this add to or detract from the kind of educational culture you want to create at your school? And if it detracts from that, then I just cannot, in good conscience, recommend proctoring. There are very limited circumstances in which proctoring is truly the best option. So, for example, like I said, if you've got students taking a test like a bar exam or something like that, where it really does need to be tightly regulated, maybe that makes sense. But try to keep proctoring limited to those cases rather than infusing it throughout a school, throughout a curriculum, and thus creating a culture of distrust and surveillance. I've included a few other slides in here on some studies if you wanted to go deeper into this. I know this video is already really long, but I hope this is helping to reinforce some different instructional strategies that you can use and how they're great, not just for learning, but for addressing cultural issues and consideration, motivation, cheating, all of these other big questions that we're asking as well.